Web of Lies, Chapter 9, Victoria.
"I'm starting to see why everyone in London hates you," said Thomas, as both engines backed into some tired old carriage sheds on the outskirts of Paddington. It was late, but they could still hear diesel motors hard at work on the other side of the robust retaining walls. The towering yard lights peered over it, blaring bright to light the way for the shunters trying desperately to reverse Diesel's brilliant mess. Thomas wanted to help, but he figured his presence there would only complicate things.
"Oh, please," Diesel scoffed. "I've never done anything on that scale. I only did it because I have nothing to lose. We're never coming back here."
Never say never. Thomas's thoughts wandered, until a tangent replaced them altogether. All that just to show Duck up. Wouldn't it have been better to one-up him instead?
"Whatever do you mean?"
"Well, shunt his yard better than he could. That would get his goat, I bet." But Diesel's face fell.
"I would have loved to, but, it would have taken ages to learn the yard plan, and,
"I thought you were revolutionary." Thomas's tone was more puzzled than mocking. "You come into a yard and improve it. That's what you say, right? Not, I study a yard 2 weeks in advance, practice for a while, refine my methods, and then improve it." He said that last bit in his very best Devious Diesel voice, which did not amuse the Gronk one bit.
"I have nothing to justify to you. I am beyond competent."
Thomas was quiet for a minute. Something rather shocking occurred to him. "Are you?" Diesel glared at him. But it wasn't the type of glare that said, "Don't underestimate me." It was the type of glare that said, "Stop prying." "Nobody's ever taught you properly, have they? That's why you're always derailing things at Tidmouth, or why you push things into the sea or bump into other engines. None of that is part of your master plan, is it?" Diesel tried to look angry, but he only looked lost and ashamed. He prided himself on being a smooth operator, but the truth was, he was only efficient on paper. When it came to putting it into practice, he was constantly falling short. But he didn't dare admit that, even to himself.
"You could never begin to comprehend my inner machinations, tank engine. I always mean what I do. Always."
He went to sleep, with little elaboration. The sheds were strangely devoid of spluttering noises when Thomas's eyelids drifted open next morning. Diesel was not beside him. Stranger still, he only felt one set of shoes on his footplate. "Where's Maxine?" he asked Marcel. "Being more generous than she'd ought to be," snarked Marcel, and they hopped down from the cab and slid the shed door open with a phoom so Thomas could see out into the yard. There was Diesel, juddering back and forth, throwing trucks into buffers and getting more frustrated with each mounting failure. Oh, Jesus. Thomas couldn't help but pity him. "Marcy, can you take me over there?" "I'm not technically certified, Thomas." "You know plenty." There it was again, that irresistible cheekiness. He was incorrigible. Marcel shrugged and decided to live a little. They'd already come this far, after all. Thomas met Diesel out in the yard. The shunter's eyes darted over to him menacingly. "Don't look," he said pitifully. "Kinda hard not to, buddy. And even if I didn't, I could hear the trucks whining. Indeed, they were all groaning dreadfully, especially the one that was upside down." "My God, how are you this bad at shunting?"
"I am not. I am a model of efficiency and precision engineering."
Thomas just glanced back and forth between the massacre of wagons strewn across 4 sidings and the smug diesel engine claiming to be talented. "Yeah, that's not enough, pal. I don't care what your blueprints suggest. You're terrible at this job." Diesel's face just went that familiar shade of red again as he looked away in disgrace. "Have you ever actually shunted a train without issue?" Diesel's embarrassment worsened. His face said no, but his voice said, with perfect certainty, "Of course." It was rather sad, actually. Diesel had never asked for help, not from anyone. He had always been intent on working things out for himself. Perhaps, Thomas thought, that's why he was so bad at marshalling wagons. And so lonely. You know, and he sounded like he regretted the offer already, but he kept talking anyway, I can teach you. Diesel eyed him with great offense and suspicion.
We Diesels don't need to learn. We know everything. We come to a yard, and we—
What is it with you and the generalizations? Cut in Thomas rather tiredly. You aren't Diesels. You're a Diesel, singular, one word. Mavis kicks ass at shunting. You don't. There's a difference right there.
In theory, we are meant to be perfectly suited to the task.
Thomas just groaned. All of this in theory nonsense. In theory, I was supposed to have enough water to go 5 miles without running dry. That's what the blueprints said. And they were wrong. And he gazed out toward the city outside the yard retaining walls. He wasn't exactly sure where they were, but he had a feeling they weren't far from his old stomping grounds. That's why they stuck me in Victoria, in the shunting yard. There was no warmth in his voice, only old miseries. His eyes remained fixed on the city skyline. He thought, just barely, he could make out the very top of those familiar station canopies. Victoria wasn't far. Thomas has made a lot of crazy decisions over the years. The one he's about to make may seem tame to you, but to him, it was by far the craziest. Tell you what, I know a place we can go and practice. It's roomy, and there's never any shortage of stock. Anyone can learn there.
What makes you so sure?
Thomas backed into Diesel and coupled on. They were back to back now, but Diesel could still imagine his serious expression when he gave his succinct answer. Because it's where I learned. And he huffed quickly out of the yard, with a reluctant Diesel in tow. He had worked his entire life to escape this job. And now, he was about to return to it voluntarily. The little blue tank engine and the little black box trundled slowly over the River Thames. They entered the mouth of the station yard. It swallowed them whole. Thomas felt a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Butterflies in the boiler. It was even more claustrophobic than he remembered. I promised I'd never come back here, he said to himself grimly. But Thomas was brave, braver now than he'd ever been in his youth. He wouldn't let anyone tell him what to do. He would defy any rule or any superior if he thought it was the right thing to do. Now, it was time to defy himself. It was time to face some old demons. You probably know of his time in Vickerstown, where he was relegated to shunting for the bigger engines like Gordon and Henry. I'm sure you recall how humiliating that was for him. London, Victoria, had been far, far worse. All of a sudden, Thomas was shaken from his anxieties. He noticed something and gasped. Well, bust my buffers! They actually went and did it. Did what? Quizzed Diesel from behind him, who could only see the world sliding away from him as Thomas dragged him backwards. But the tank engine decided not to elaborate. Nothing. Things have just changed a lot. Here, and he traversed an unexpected set of points. Let's wait for a path to the goods yard. It will be better for our purposes.
The goods yard?
Diesel was puzzled. He had expected Thomas to teach him about carriages. They were, after all, at a terminus station. Surely the carriage sidings were the place to go. But beggars couldn't be choosers, and despite his best efforts to deny it, Diesel desperately needed to learn. They came to a stop in a wide-open switchyard with many sprawling lines. They were surrounded by industry and dense urban development on all sides. It was rather messy, litter strewn all over the place. Discarded newspapers and used paper cups lie between the sleepers. Some fluttered across the yard, riding on the breeze. You'd never see litter like this on Sodor, Thomas thought. Many of the tracks ended in sheds, ranging from small to enormous, likely for transferring goods from road to rail. No one was around. All was quiet. The evening light began to turn everything from a twinkling gold to a chilly blue. Thomas shunted Diesel onto his own line, and Marcel took up their post in Diesel's cab again. That was the only way this was going to work, after all. Thomas spoke with a voice full of experience. "All right, first things first. You've got to gauge your speed approaching trucks. If you don't slow down gradually, you'll hit them hard and push them away from you. Ideally, you're barely touching them when the shunter couples you up." Typically, Thomas shared his wisdom with others in a boastful tone, but not this time. If anything, he seemed a little embarrassed that he was so knowledgeable about the subject. He wasn't showing off in the slightest. This was purely for Diesel's benefit. This, of course, made the Gronk skeptical.
"Why are you doing this?"
"Because you're a wanker and you're angry all the time," said Thomas abruptly. "And this is probably part of the reason, isn't it?" Diesel processed the insult. It made sense logically. It'd be easier for everyone on Sodor, Thomas included, if Diesel were better at his job. It's not like they feared him replacing them anymore. Whether they should underestimate him was a different matter. But they did, and that meant that Thomas had no reason to withhold his wisdom. Even so, Diesel couldn't accept it.
"This shouldn't be necessary. I was built for this."
Thomas looked backwards towards his own uniquely shaped side tanks, the way they jutted forward at the top, hanging over his splashers. "Well, I was, and I was flawed anyway. That's why I'm this handsome shape. Sometimes the plan that's laid out for us is dumb, so you make a new one. You understand that, don't you? You love backup plans."
"I don't love them, I just see the necessity for them."
"Well then, maybe you can also see the necessity for a few shunting lessons. I'm a bit rusty, but I think I've still got it." Diesel didn't say anything for quite some time. He knew what the acceptable answer was. Absolutely not. But he had struggled with this ability his entire life, and he had never allowed himself to admit his failings. Every time he had made a mistake, he'd only gotten angry and took out the nearest box fan. Maybe it was time to change that. Maybe it was time to ask for help. But from Thomas the Tank Engine? Could he survive the shame of that? Perhaps it wasn't shameful. Perhaps it was opportunistic. After all, here was a longtime enemy of his offering up his trade secrets. He would be a fool not to exploit his generosity. Yes, Diesel liked that framing a lot more. He wasn't receiving help. He was manipulating Thomas. This was just another con, another intellectual victory. But it wasn't, of course. It was a very sad, old diesel engine learning to do a job he should have been tutored in 30 years ago. But he would never have accepted this olive branch without cloaking it in delusion. He had lived and breathed in deception for too long. He couldn't come by anything honestly anymore. But if ever there was a path out of this suffocating web of lies, the first stepping stone was the tank engine and his shunting lesson. So they began. "All right, so watch closely." Thomas approached the long metal van slowly and just barely tapped it with his rear buffers. He pushed it for some time along the siding until it stopped delicately before one of the sheds. Diesel marveled. He had moved the thing so effortlessly, and he had even done it backwards. "Your turn," said Thomas, darting his eyes towards a smaller van that sat on Diesel's line. Diesel almost turned pale. His eyes focused intensely. The yard grew so silent you could hear a discarded plastic bag drifting through the breeze. He drew forward slowly, like a wolf sneaking up on its prey. And then he floored it! Marcel was thrown backward in the cab, and both buffers caved in on the sleeping van. When the poor fellow awoke, his face was buried in a brick retaining wall, and crates of what looked like mangoes were tumbling out of both broken doors. A few lights came on in some nearby apartments.
"This isn't fair," Diesel seethed. "Your van was different. This is not a controlled experiment."
Thomas just sighed. "It's not a competition, Diesel. I'm teaching you the basics here. You should know how to shunt both." Diesel knew that, of course, but he was too angry to think straight.
"It's my blasted engine," he deflected angrily. "If only they hadn't turned on me back at Derby.
I could have, but Thomas was having none of it. "It's nothing to do with your engine. Yeah, it sounds bad. You're in serious need of a tune-up. But if you knew what you were doing, you could work around it.
What, like you and your freakishly long tanks?
He snapped vitriolically. Thomas coasted backward in shock. His face settled into a bitter frown. Forget it, he hissed, clearly wounded. You know everything, right? What am I wasting my time for? This lesson was obviously not going anywhere. Marcel climbed resignedly down from Diesel's control room, shutting the door tight behind them. They returned to their rightful spot in Thomas's cab. To think I came back here for an ungrateful sod like you! Unbelievable. Diesel just studied him for a minute, intently. And then, for the first time on this entire misadventure, Diesel asked a question about Thomas he genuinely wanted to hear the answer to.
Why do you hate this place so much? What memories does it hold?
Thomas looked at Diesel thoughtfully. He was silent for an uncharacteristically long time. This was important to him. When he did speak, it was with a bashful laugh. You know, if you had asked me that question a few years ago, I would have told you to shove it. Hell, that's what I used to tell Percy when he asked.
Is it any surprise that people are curious? The racehorse blathers on endlessly about his Nigel Gresley. The Victorian has his stories about the finesse. But none of them like to talk about themselves as much as you do. And yet, your origins are a mystery. To all of us.
Thomas gave him a half-hearted look, as if he was indecisive on whether to continue with this conversation. It was a lack of certainty that Diesel had never witnessed in this engine before. When at last the tank engine switched lines and came face to face with him, Diesel knew he was about to recount some deep-seated memories. It's because I'm embarrassed. Thomas took a deep breath. He felt the hot air course through his boiler flues, and the small relief as it whooshed out his funnel. The skybound steam carried away all hesitation. I was a disappointment. My railway, it built a lot of great engines over the years. Engines that made big waves.
Ah, like that Stepney the Bluebell engine,
said Diesel rather carelessly. Thomas scowled, but he let it go with another puff of steam. Yeah, like him. His class changed the face of London. And there were a lot of other notable ones, too, that made big strides. And then we came out. Mr. Billington's E2s. And we were...
Failures? Let me guess. Poor fuel capacity.
Ouch! He said it like it was a physical pain, not an emotional one. No need to be that blunt.
You said be honest.
I didn't say be mean. Diesel didn't know the difference. He'd never learned it. Thomas continued. But that's what makes this so difficult, Diesel. We weren't failures. We were just... average. We weren't horrible, but we also weren't that great at anything. They put me on goods trains, and I wasn't the best. They trialed me on passengers, and I was too rough, apparently. When my crew remarked on it, He couldn't help but chuckle. I threw my coal back at them. My driver caught a lump in the shoulder. Oh, I could be such a terror. Eventually, they made us... shunters. He said that last word in the most miserable voice, as if it was the worst thing an engine could be, as if he was ashamed for having ever been one. Because he was. Diesel took offense.
What's wrong with being a shunter?
Nothing, assured Thomas. But I was always destined for more. I knew I was. But nobody in this bloody town thought so. Everyone said we were dull, unimpressive machines. And more than anything, I wanted to prove them wrong. So I left. And all the passion and determination ran back into his face. Another gust of wind blew past and brought more garbage with it. A newspaper slid along the sleepers. He looked down at it and grinned with the greatest satisfaction. And I did. The headline proved him right. Television star spotted in London, and on the front page, a huge photo of Thomas the Tank Engine. A huge photo of an LBSC E2 tank engine. The only reason they will ever be remembered. So I suppose I wasn't a disappointment, in the end. But there was no supposing about it. His smug grin made it all too obvious. He knew he was an icon. Diesel's fan spluttered as he tried to put the pieces together. He'd heard a lot of new information all at once. One question rose above the rest.
"Did you say you left?" he snarled. "You just up and left the LBSC. That seems a bit daft, doesn't it?"
Well, if you're clever, you can get out of any jam. And he winked, implying he wouldn't reveal much more about his methods. And it was wartime. There was a lot going on. Good time to slip out. I was much more use on Sodor anyway. And he grinned, remembering what Edward had looked like in red. It seemed like yesterday. Diesel's mind was still abuzz. He had another question, and this one was much broader.
"Why would you tell me all this?"
He was genuinely perplexed. He couldn't understand it. Thomas knew his track record. Diesel would weaponize any intimate knowledge he was given. The words, "in confidence," meant nothing to him. They were simply artillery in his war of manipulation. Because it's not a secret anymore. Everybody knows. I mean, it took me 60 years to tell them, but I did. It hurts to hide things. Truth is, if you're ashamed of yourself, it doesn't matter if you manage to hide it from everybody else. You still know. You might as well air it all out. And then he smiled, remembering how his friends had reacted. And odds are, you're ashamed for nothing. It always sounds so much worse in our heads. Diesel's thoughts wandered again. His tongue went with them.
"Unless you really are rotten on the inside. Then they'll confirm your greatest fears."
The sorrow on Thomas's face confirmed to Diesel that he'd been thinking out loud again. He cursed himself. For years he'd prided himself on maintaining the steel trap that was his mind. How was it that this unassuming blue tank engine had drawn his true thoughts out of him more than once? Maybe there was something special about him. Maybe this is why he had so many friends. He cursed the thought, even harder than he cursed his slip of the tongue. A slip of the tongue which Thomas had heard clear as day and was keen to remark on. Everybody knows you're rotten, Diesel, but it's because of the things you've done. You weren't a bad engine until you started lying and hurting people. So why did you start? Because he had never trusted anybody. Because he had calculated that the safest way to navigate the world was to fashion a charming persona and convince everyone it was the truth. Because deep down he was afraid to be himself. Because you only get one true self. But you get a million aliases. That's why he'd started telling lies in his youth, and now he was doing it because he had always done it, and it was too late to turn back now. That was why. That is not what he told Thomas.
"Because there were things more important than me hanging in the balance. Steam engines reigned supreme when I entered the world. If I didn't give people a reason to doubt them, they never would have given diesels a chance. So yes, I lied. But the bigger picture was always true. We are the future."
"The present now," corrected Thomas, "and soon to be the past."
"Lunacy," dismissed Diesel. "We are the pinnacle of transportation. Nothing can replace us. There isn't anything more refined."
At that moment, an electric multiple unit zipped behind Diesel on its way to the now fully electrified terminus station. Diesel didn't so much as notice. Thomas just settled into his springs and smiled with pity. "Do you know why I didn't take you to the station proper? Why we had to settle for this little goods yard on the fringes?" Diesel puzzled.
"I was indeed wondering. Tutelage and shunting coaches would be far more useful."
"Because it's all electric now. Most of the trains are multiple units. They don't even need shunters. It's wondrous, really." And he marveled at the third rail that ran alongside the two that held his wheels, even here. "I've always liked electric traction. The LBSC was among the first railways to try it out, you know. I find that electric engines are nice on the whole. Quiet. Not my style, but I respect it." Ha 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 ha, laughed Diesel very nervously.
You've undercut your point before you even made it. It's ancient technology. The only thing it's good for is the tube. It will never fully take over the main lines.
Thomas just gave a short, self-assured chuckle. Yeah, it will. And honestly, I won't mind when it does. Though for Gordon's sake, I hope it takes a while. And then he added sternly, "Do not tell him I said that." As if Diesel could, or would, keep a secret. But he'd barely heard him. He was too focused on the dark reality Thomas had just woven for him.
It won't happen. BR is far too sensible for that.
Sensible indeed! How is it that you're such a smartass about everything else, but you can't see how stupid the leadership of your railway is? They make the worst decisions, Diesel.
Watch your tongue, tank engine. Diesel was dead serious. This is my railway you are talking about.
Are you sure? Replied Thomas, with the three most dangerous words he could have followed Diesel's threat up with. Why do they keep sending you away, then? Diesel bit his tongue so hard he would have gone right through it if it had really been there. His forehead and cheeks turned a vibrant red.
I have made some political missteps, he recounted rather generously, but it is no fault of BR, and they have never once sent me away. Do you know why?
Because they don't know you exist, Thomas said aloofly. Diesel's face grew redder somehow. That was too far. Maybe not even because it was insulting, but because it was too close to the truth. He doubled down.
No.
And his furious frown became a demented and cruel grin.
Because there's nowhere to send me. They own it all, Thomas. They've never sent me to the Northwestern Railway.
His grin widened. His eyes burned with hate.
They've only ever sent me to the Northwestern region of British Railways.
Fuck you, scowled the Sudrian.
Your railway's a farce. It hasn't existed since 1948. They let you keep the single-digit numbers and the stupid colours because they can't be bothered with you. But one day, your region will prove too expensive, and they'll wipe it all out because they have that power.
And if they ever try, we'll blow the damn bridge! They were both shouting now. A week of resenting each other's company had finally gotten to them.
And then you'll be common terrorists. And then they'll send out the army, and the Royal Air Force, and the Navy. Shut the fuck up! And they'll ravage your towns, and they'll fly planes over Tidmouth, and Knapford, and Farquhar, and they'll bomb you out until you remember what empire you're part of!
But Diesel's rant was ended for him when Thomas charged headlong into his grill and ran him through the back of a nearby goods shed. "Ooh!" said Diesel in a very timid, weaselly tone. He must have imagined he was untouchable, but he wasn't. His whole engine compartment was caked in ancient brown brick dust. Little particles of Victoria. "Go on! Keep planning your invasion! I want to know what ports to fortify! We won 2 wars, and we'll win a 3rd! You don't scare us, you creep!" But Diesel said nothing. He just caught his breath. He looked rather pathetic, slumping to the side, his wheels only halfway on the rails. His exposed side rods had caught fragments of wood from the shattered buffers that had failed to stand up to Thomas's fury.
"Enough," he finally said. "This is childish."
Thomas was still breathing heavily, but after considerable effort, he managed to steady himself. He backed up a few yards. "You may not understand this, being built in the 50s, he said gravely. "But you don't joke about war, or the Navy, or the Air Force. You just don't." Diesel understood, and also with considerable effort, he brought his massive ego under control. He felt, personally, that Thomas was being overly emotional, but he also knew it was wise not to trigger this reaction again. So he would respect this particular boundary going forward.
"Very well."
And he looked to Thomas, a hint of desperation on his brow.
"Are you going to leave me here?"
Thomas just sighed. "Of course not. Come on." When they took their leave from Victoria the next morning, they left behind a gronk-shaped hole.